All right, we've actually got some ceasefire negotiations to talk about today, but spoiler alert, I don't think they're going to go anywhere. We're going to talk about those alongside continued ground operations in southern Lebanon, the Israeli actions in Gaza over the last couple of weeks, and finally, of course, we got to get into the ICC arrest warrants that were issued for Netanyahu, Gallant, and Mohammed Deif just this last week. We're going to talk about, probably most importantly, what they don't mean, what they do mean, and then what to expect there going forward. So let's get into it. Starting up north in the ongoing war between Israel and Hezbollah, ground operations there largely have continued unimpeded. We are seeing a kind of continuation of airstrikes all across Lebanon, with a lot targeting Beirut specifically. In the footage coming out from the IDF, we're seeing them come across near daily additional tunnels, a lot of different weapon storage, rocket launchers aimed into Israeli territory, and then the occasional Hezbollah fighter who, unlike his buddies that fled north, actually stayed back and decided to take on the Israeli forces. It doesn't look like that's happening an awful lot. Right now, by and large, the Hezbollah response has mostly been in the form of rocket, drone, and missile attacks into Israeli territory, and it really ramped up just in the last 24 hours. In fact, yesterday, Sunday, November 24th, Israel said that around 250 rockets had been fired by Hezbollah across the border from Lebanon, marking the heaviest bombardment in a single day since Israel kind of intensified the fighting in Lebanon in September. Now, a lot of these were intercepted, and we have some pretty crazy footage of the interceptions actually taking place, but more and more, Hezbollah is finding ways to get some of these rockets, missiles, and drones through Israeli air defense, and just yesterday, there were several people injured inside of Israel and quite a few buildings damaged, both in northern and central Israel, some of them actually near Tel Aviv. Now, this wave of Hezbollah strikes followed an Israeli airstrike on central Beirut on Saturday, in which the Lebanese health ministry said that 29 people were killed. Now, one thing we're not hearing nearly as much about in recent weeks are the elimination of high-value targets in the Hezbollah organization. That's not for lack of effort by Israel. In fact, Israeli airstrikes are near continuous against Hezbollah infrastructure across Lebanon. There's just not that many high-value targets remaining in the Hezbollah organization. There was one eliminated this last week. On November 17th, Israel says they carried out a strike in Beirut and eliminated Mohammed Afif, Hezbollah's chief spokesperson. That's like the highest ranking Hezbollah guy in quite a while. Again, we're seeing some guys, they're continuing to knock out leadership. The challenge is these fighters are having to be elevated from positions where just a couple weeks ago even, they were relatively low-level fighters, and all of a sudden they're squad, company, or battalion-level commanders. Israel is still eliminating them, but they're unknown, right, and really didn't have a significant presence on the battlefield just, a couple weeks ago. Oh, hey, we just rolled out a new national security podcast called Unclassified. It's here on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, everywhere you listen to podcasts. I'll link it in the description below if interested. It's myself and a friend of mine, Ben Wheeler, talking, in this case, for about an hour and a half. We'll go in every week, diving into a variety of kind of pressing national security issues. So this week we talked about the escalation in Ukraine. These arrest warrants in Israel, China-Taiwan issues. And then we actually got a little bit into some of Trump's national security picks for his coming administration. If interested, check it out. Let me know what you think. And then continuing on with what I'll call a couple issues in southern Lebanon, I want to talk about UNFIL for a minute and highlight just some examples from this past week that I think will show the challenge they face, and really this whole situation faces, when we're talking about a possibility of a ceasefire and the role that UNFIL may or may not play. Now, as a reminder, UNFIL is the United Nations mission in southern Lebanon designed to, or their goal there is to enforce UN Resolution 1701, prevent Hezbollah from re-infiltrating south of the Litani River. I don't think there's any other way to put it at this point than they failed. Just the recent examples of Hezbollah tunnels being, 100 meters outside of the gate to a UNIFIL post, pretty clear. They were not effective at accomplishing this mission. But just this past week, it kind of reached a whole new level. So we had two cases in the exact same day where Hezbollah fired rockets from southern Lebanon, and not only did they impact in Lebanon, they actually impacted in UNIFIL bases. The IDF put out a couple different statements on this, some analysis of the rocket trajectory, where the rockets were launched from, the time they were launched, where all of them landed, with the exception of a couple that decided to pop up incredibly short and actually cause damage and supposedly some injuries to UNIFIL personnel in Lebanon. Twice in one day. That's solid. But again, a lot of these rockets that Hezbollah is firing, not as many as we'd see from Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but not all of them are in pristine condition, right? Some of them are going to do this, where they're going to fly wildly off track. But that wasn't even the best of it. My favorite issue this last week, it's funny. You have to laugh at this, but it's also kind of sad and kind of shows just the challenges that are going to persist in this region for quite a while. UNFIL put out a statement, and I think it's worth running through this word for word to kind of give you the whole thing here. They said, yesterday afternoon, a UNFIL patrol involving French and Finnish peacekeepers, while conducting a patrol in the village of Bidas, faced a denial of freedom movement from a group of individuals with at least one of them armed. Who could that be? We'll have to keep reading. The patrol managed to get around the obstruction and continued along its planned route. About an hour later, when the patrol had just crossed the village of Maracay, it was fired upon about 40 times from behind, likely from non-state actors. So we're narrowing it down a little bit. We're getting closer, right? It was armed individuals. Now we've got non-state actors. They say it is unacceptable that UNIFIL peacekeepers, while conducting Security Council mandated tasks, are routinely targeted. Yesterday's incident serves as yet another stark reminder about the dangerous situation under which the peacekeepers operate daily in southern Lebanon. Sure, yeah, targeting UN staff is bad. Still feels like they could have talked about maybe the group responsible here, but I'm sure they'll get to it here in a second. They say they must, just they, didn't actually go with naming anyone here, must respect the inviolability of UN personnel and premises at all times. Any attack against the peacekeepers is a flagrant violation of international laws and UN Resolution 1701, which forms the basis of UNIFIL's current mandate. No mention of Hezbollah throughout that entire thing. Just an unknown, non-state actor, armed group that was firing on UNIFIL. That's the challenge here, right? And I think that's something you have to keep in mind when we get into the ceasefire proposals that are kind of circulating right now, and what role is UNIFIL going to play in that? And this was laughable, right? Like, just say it. Just say it was Hezbollah. If it wasn't Hezbollah, say it was somebody else, or maybe make clear that it wasn't the IDF, right? They did everything except say the word Hezbollah in that statement, and it really from my perspective, it really damages their credibility. Call a spade, right? Now, moving into the ceasefire proposals here, it's possible a ceasefire could come about in the next little bit here. I'm pretty skeptical because if you look at the results of the most recent U.S. presidential election, by and large, it's a very pro-Israel group across the board. Like, not just Trump himself, but if you look at the people he's putting into positions of authority, by and large, very, very pro-Israel. Yeah. So the idea here that Israel would be kind of racing to get anything done before Trump's inauguration, I don't see a reason why they would do that. They're probably going to have more bargaining power in about 60 days. But anyways, diving into this Hezbollah ceasefire, they say Israel has agreed in principle to a U.S.-backed ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is now working on how to present it to the public. And that's according to multiple reports on Sunday night. They say the reports, which cited officials in Jerusalem, Washington, and Beirut, all noted that approval of the proposal was not final and that several issues must still be ironed out, but that Jerusalem had okayed the main tenets of the proposal. But some of those main tenets are probably still going to get hung up. Now, listen to this. They say Haaretz reported that the proposal will include 3 stages: a truce, followed by Hezbollah removing its forces north of the Litani River, an Israeli pullout from southern Lebanon, and finally, Israeli-Lebanese negotiations on demarcation of contested border areas. It is said an international body led by the United States will be tasked with monitoring the ceasefire, and that Israel expects to receive a letter from Washington affirming its right to act militarily should Hezbollah break the terms of the ceasefire amid no action by Lebanon's military international forces. Under the potential ceasefire, the Lebanese army would be responsible for preventing Hezbollah from reestablishing itself in southern Lebanon. So again, real quick, truce, and Israel has to truce, Hezbollah has to remove its forces to north of the Litani River. Israel has to leave southern Lebanon, and then eventually they agree on some demarcation line. Hezbollah does not have the upper hand in these negotiations right now, not by a long shot. However, Israel really has Hezbollah on the ropes. It's hard to imagine that they would say, fine, enough, just move back north, we'll call it a day. I think that was the plan for a long time, but look, Israel's been very, very successful in kind of eliminating a lot of Hezbollah's capabilities. I have to imagine there's people inside the Israeli government looking at this as the opportunity to kind of wipe them out once and for all. Personal opinion there. I don't know that the Lebanese military has the ability to enforce this at all. So that's going to be a problem, right? And we just showed what UNIFIL was up to. Apparently not really able to do this either. And then the piece about the United States kind of monitoring the ceasefire, that suggests troops on the ground. I don't know that that's in the cards, personally. It seems that kind of flew under the radar here, kind of inserted, like, by the way, the U.S. is going to be the ones monitoring this ceasefire. We'll see. My gut tells me that across party lines, that's not going to be very popular here in the United States. But either way, there are ceasefire negotiations ongoing between Israel and Hezbollah. They're closer now than they've been throughout the duration of this war. We'll see where it goes. Now, let's shift down into Gaza, where that war is still very much ongoing. In fact, Israel has continued ground operations just recently in Jabalia, Beit Lahia, as well as Rafah. Similar to what we're seeing in southern Lebanon, there are near daily videos coming out from the IDF showing that they're finding, weapons much lower quality than what they're finding in Lebanon, for what it's worth, and that was expected. We that's what we thought we would see. In Lebanon, they're pulling out a lot of, newly packaged military equipment. You get down to the Gaza Strip, and there's still a lot of like homemade type equipment, things that have been clearly smuggled through tunnels and in pretty rough shape. Nonetheless, a lot of videos of Israel uncovering that equipment. Still a lot of tunnels that are being identified and destroyed or sealed up. And then quite a few operations in the Gaza Strip recently where Israel's continued to eliminate Hamas militants. In fact, earlier this week, an Israeli airstrike eliminated Al-Qaman Abed Eslam Khalil Anbar, who is responsible for fire support in the Islamic Jihad's Gaza City Brigade. And then they conducted another strike that eliminated a couple company commanders of the Nukba force, which were responsible for helping to command the invasion of Israeli territory on October 7th. Now, in turning to the ceasefire proposal in Gaza, this, of course, has been going on for quite a while now. No real progress. I think what people could point to in recent days is that there was a UN vote, Security Council vote, that was vetoed by the United States. But if we just dig into that a little bit, I think it's pretty clear why. So the UN vote just this past week was vetoed by the United States because it was not linked to an immediate release of the hostages that were still held by Hamas, which, again, regardless of how you feel about this war, I think we can all agree that if Hamas keeps the hostages after a ceasefire, it's not going to end, right? Israel's still going to make efforts to go and get those hostages in some way, shape, or form. It seems like we can't properly talk about a ceasefire without addressing that key component. In fact, Hamas has talked about that recently and said that they are not going to release the hostages unless there's a complete and total end to the war. And they put out, one of their spokespersons said, like, this is our bargaining chip. Why would we ever give that up? Now, in addressing this, the U.S. Deputy Ambassador Robert Wood said, quote, "We made clear throughout negotiations we would not support an unconditional ceasefire that failed to release the hostages." And then, of course, we have a statement from Hamas on this as well, who strongly condemned the U.S. veto, saying, quote, "It demonstrated the U.S.'s direct involvement in the aggression against our people, acting as an accomplice in the killing of children and women and the complete destruction of civilian life in Gaza. We demand the U.S. to stop this clumsy, hostile policy if it truly seeks to end wars and achieve security and stability in the region, as we heard from the upcoming administration." Again, I'm not so sure the upcoming administration is going to be less pro-Israeli. I have a feeling, if just gut at this point, it seems like, if anything, the Trump administration probably put more pressure on Hamas and that side of the bargaining table. But again, personal opinion. Now, something worth keeping in mind whenever we talk about these Gaza ceasefire deals is there are still an estimated 100 hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, with as many as 60 of those still believed to be alive. Just have to keep that in mind. There are still people being held in captivity in Gaza. Now let's turn to the ICC arrest warrants that were just issued this past week, what they mean, maybe more importantly, what they don't mean, and then what to expect going forward. So a quick note here, you have the ICJ, which is the International Court of Justice. That hears disputes between nations. And then you have the ICC, which prosecutes individuals, the International Criminal Court. What we're talking about today is the ICC. So this past week, the ICC accused Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant of the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts. And one that kind of flew under the radar here at the same time is in that same statement, they also accused Mohammed Deif, the former leader of the Hamas military wing in Gaza, to be a key plotter of the October 7th attack in Israel, of crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, sexual violence, and hostage-taking. Now, Deif was killed a few months back, and apparently they put this out because they say they haven't been able to confirm independently that Deif was killed. But, like, even Hamas's allies are talking about, like, for a long time, have recognized that he was killed by Israel. But either way, we got those 3 arrest warrants that came out. Now, what they don't mean, and we're already seeing this a lot, Legally, a warrant does not equal guilt, right? Whether it's the United States or I can't speak to anybody else's legal system, but it applies in the United States and it's the same in the ICC. I know a lot of folks are interpreting that way, saying, why would they ever issue a warrant if the person wasn't guilty? But the way this process has to play out, or it's designed to play out, is the ICC issues the warrant saying they want to bring these people in to stand trial for the crimes that they're accused of. So again, the warrant does not automatically equal guilt. Now, that whole bringing them in to stand trial is probably not going to happen. First off, the court, the ICC, can't try people in absentia, and they have no mechanism to actually force these people, these defendants, to stand trial, as in they have to physically be there to actually see this case through. And there's a couple of different challenges worth mentioning here. First off, the enforcement of this. You've got the United States, China, and Russia are not members. They didn't sign on to the Rome Statute. They're not members of the ICC. That said, there's a first time for everything. It's possible entirely that this is the time that we see, one of these cases. Putin has an arrest warrant out, and there's nobody really holding their breath that he's going to end up at The Hague anytime soon. So it's possible, but there are a lot of challenges. Another one here is jurisdiction. So in addition to the United States, China, and Russia, kind of the large world powers not being signatory to the Rome Statute, neither is Israel or Gaza. So, how do they have the jurisdiction over a party that didn't sign on to this in that party's territory is an argument that's being put forward. Now, the ICC has successfully issued arrest warrants and tried people from member states that were not signatory to the agreement in the past. We're talking about humanitarian situation in Darfur, and then Libya in 2005, and then Libya in 2011. So it can be done. It has been done. I don't know that I would necessarily hold my breath in this case that Netanyahu or Gallant are going to be arrested and extradited and moved to The Hague to stand trial. Now, in looking at some of the global reactions here, starting with, of course, the Israeli reaction, Netanyahu said, quote, "I reject with disgust the comparison of the prosecutor in The Hague between democratic Israel and the mass murders of Hamas." Turning here to the United States, arguably the most important in this, right? There's a lot of mechanisms the United States can push and pull to try to influence how this actually plays out. The White House spokesperson said, quote, "We fundamentally reject the court's decision to issue arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials." Senator Tom Cotton said, quote, "The ICC is a kangaroo court, and Karim Khan is a deranged fanatic. Woe to him and anyone who tries to enforce these outlaw warrants." And then one that I really thought was notable and worth bringing up here was Congressman Mike Waltz, who's the incoming National Security Advisor for President-elect Trump. He said, quote, "The ICC has no credibility, and these allegations have been refuted by the United States government. Israel has lawfully defended its people and borders from genocidal terrorists. You can expect a strong response to the anti-Semitic bias of the ICC and United Nations come January." Kind of sets the stage for what, again, might Israel and the world can kind of expect, how the United States is going to approach this conflict here in the next 60 days. And of course, we've got to turn over to the Iranian reaction to this. I feel like that's important. But the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei said, quote, "They issued an arrest warrant. That's not enough. Death sentence must be issued for these criminal leaders." So across the board, right? Some say it's too much. You've got the Iranians saying it's not nearly enough. Look, I don't want to write this thing off too much. It's still very meaningful, the fact that there's a lot of countries around the world, the majority of countries around the world actually, that are signatories to the ICC. So, and there are a lot of countries already, U.S. and Israeli allies, really, that have said they will enforce this arrest warrant and will arrest Netanyahu or Gallant. So I don't want to write it off entirely. There is the possibility. It's going to impact Israel. It's going to impact Israeli leadership. It's going to restrict where they're able to travel and possibly some of the relationships that these countries have with Israel going forward. So I don't mean to dismiss this entirely. I think if we look at the key aspect here of these two leaders actually going to The Hague, being arrested and standing trial, that's probably pretty low likelihood. But there are second, third, and fourth order effects, of course. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.